Hi everybody. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I want to especially thank Moira Klaus, who is showing the slides for me because I've had some pretty serious internet problems today. I am representing the Nature Conservancy in the state of New Mexico, and we've been a partner over the last decade in developing these forest action plans that in our state are forming the basis of shared stewardship. And as William said, he gave credit to my co-author here and really primary analyst for the work I'm going to show you, which is Steve Bassett. Steve's on paternity leave, so he just had a baby, so I'll do my best. So just know that I was not the analyst on this project. I will be talking a little bit about the role that all this mapped information plays in us setting priorities collaboratively in New Mexico. And there'll be, plenty of opportunities. I could respond by email or do my best in the Q&A afterwards. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to take a little cue from Jordan here, and for those of you that work at the state level, you like people to know about your state. So this is a map of New Mexico, and for the purposes of the shared stewardship, just know that about a third of our state is in forest, and much of that is managed by the U.S. Forest Service. So our primary partner on this project that I'm describing was New Mexico Forestry Division. We were acting as a contractor to develop the analysis and to assist with the collaborative work to help set those priorities. And this just gives you a little flavor of how land is distributed within the state. The Division of Forestry in New Mexico does not have its own land base. The land managing agency in the state is primarily the state land office, and that's all those little blue blobs and dots and so forth. And then you can see the importance that tribal lands have in our state. And one thing I didn't note on the side, but you can see this big gray kind of rectangle towards the bottom of the state. That's the White Sands Missile Range. So military installations are also important in the state. New Mexico has, I'm happy to say, a really strong track record in collaborative work in forest management. And in my tenure, the collaborative forest restoration program, which was established by Congress in 2001, was really kind of a major jumping off point for lots of people that are interested in both working in the forests and preserving the values that exist in forests. And the Collaborative Forest Restoration Program provides grants to groups, multi-party groups, and was really the foundational model for the now National Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Project, which some of you may be engaged in your states. In 2005, the State Forestry Division also initiated a forest and watershed health plan in response to the wildfire cohesive strategy and the establishment of the National Fire Plan. And in 2006, in order to try to find that zone of agreement, forest interested organizations developed a set of restoration principles. And at that particular time, one of the major concerns would be making sure that the treatments, the thinning and fire and so forth were appropriate to the long-term desired values on the landscape, and in particular to address the concerns about large trees and old growth. The first forest action plan, and I'm happy to say the Nature Conservancy was engaged in that as well, was in 2010. And then again, here we are in 2020 to talk about the next step. The shared stewardship agreement between the Southwest Region of the Forest Service and the Forestry Division in New Mexico was signed in November of 2019. And so the way that the agreement is written, and it's really fun to see the different flavors and how the states and the Forest Service are kind of tracking their collaboration. But in this case, because of the better developing data and activities, we thought it was best that the two lead agencies really think about meeting in on a regular basis, and the planning tools that they would use for the land management plans on the Forest Service side, and the Forest Action Plan for the state-based partners. Important characteristic of our state is that we really recognize and try to incorporate as well as we can all of our indigenous nations. We've got about 25 tribes in the state. And we also have, we're a very old state in terms of European settlement. So Hispanic land grants and those communities that still rely on those land grants are also incorporated into the agreement. The parties agreed that we would track measurable outcomes, jointly communicate the importance of shared stewardship, and that the Forest Action Plan that I'm going to dive into here now is going to be the primary tool to guide co-management of lands in New Mexico. Okay, so the action plan has two basic pieces, and one is a set of 10 strategies, and then the other is the actual resource assessment. And I'm going to flip this around and talk about the resource assessment and show you some maps and kind of the approach, and then talk about the strategies. Well, both pieces of the development of this plan were very collaborative. So what we did, and this, it turns out, was a good plan, especially after COVID became such a problem, is we used the existing partnership, the New Mexico Forest and Watershed Health Coordinating Group, and that group has been extremely valuable to the state over a lot of these large-scale planning processes. It was really kind of launched with the Forest and Watershed Health Plan, and that really has membership from every state agency, every land managing federal agency, and a lot of interest groups, NGOs like the Nature Conservancy. So this group meets on a regular basis to talk and to share information, and so they were a really logical place to focus our collaborative efforts. We used the members of this group and additional experts to create technical panels. And you can see we had over 100 subject matter experts. We had asked them for all the statewide data that they might have that would be relevant to the process. And each of these technical panels had several webinars associated with it where the group collaboratively decided what the appropriate data sets would be to characterize either threats or values. So the approach that New Mexico chose to take was using a risk assessment framework. And for any of you that have been working on the West and looking at wildfire risk, you may be familiar with this framework documented by the Rocky Mountain Research Station by Joe Scott et al. And so really the foundational things that we're trying to do in a mapped fashion is to say, where are those things that we really care about? And then what are the risks to those things? And then where should the investments go once you kind of put those two things together? Okay, so here just gives you kind of a little bit of a crosswalk to how things are structured. We have these values themes on the running down the left-hand vertical side, the y-axis, and on the x-axis at the top you can see the threats. And then really you kind of are combining things in a variety of ways to come up with the risk of a particular threat to particular values, or you can combine them all together. All right, just as a reminder here, because that type was pretty small in the previous slide, here are the resources that the collaborators agreed upon and started providing input on data for. So you can see it really ranged from urban forests to the wildland communities, water, biodiversity, etc. The threats that were assessed were, of course, wildfire, as Jordan mentioned in his presentation. And we also looked at disease in insects, development and fragmentation, post-fire risk, climate change risk, and erosion. And I'm going to just run you through a few maps to give you a flavor for how some of this groupings of maps and models can be used for a variety of purpose. And all this data is public data. And in the past, this data has been used by multiple agencies and researchers and so forth. So we're looking forward to more of that. So this particular example speaks to water supply for irrigation. So one of the things you want to know is a little bit about what's the precipitation like in the state, and what's the evapotranspiration rate. So kind of to help guide us to answer the questions, where is the water used by irrigators and how many irrigators rely on diversions? We have the map diversions. Where are people actually taking the water from in this map? And here's the surface water runoff to numbers of irrigators. And so if there are a lot of irrigators, you get a darker color. If there are fewer irrigators, then you get a little less. And so here's kind of like density of irrigation requirements by watershed. So all of that is to sum up to say, there is all of this data that we have provided is built on layers and layers of information that then partners can use to answer questions that they may have. So we hope that that ends up being a useful product. I also wanted to highlight a bit about the debris flow hazard here in this example for two reasons. One, again, to show that in order to answer the question of where the hazard is, you need more than one kind of analysis product. And then the other thing is to point out that most of our interest in our state, especially regarding surface water threats, it's both the fire itself and then what happens after the fire. Because for those of you who've already had this experience, as a lot of the West has, it's the debris flow afterward that really causes problems in your infrastructure. It fills reservoirs. It prevents water from getting where it needs to be. So you lose capacity there. And of course, this hazard is also a danger to people and other values. Well, one of the things I think a lot of us are really contemplating right now is what are the consequences of climate change going to be? And in 2018, our new governor, Michelle Lujan Grisham, became part of the U.S. Climate Alliance. About half the states in the country are part of the Climate Alliance. And so that kind of set the state on a path to actively think about what the risks of climate change are and what we might be able to do to mitigate it. So some of the data that was pulled together to assess the risk here was things like what's really our carbon on the landscape. And we used fuels data and biomass information for forests, dead material, and so forth. And then I thought this was kind of an interesting product. It really shows potential in the soil itself. And besides, it's kind of a nice, colorful map, so it's good to look at. So here's another thing. So we have the carbon, and then here's the risk of carbon for release by wildfires. One of the things that we know in the West is that fire is a natural and continuous process, and our way to store carbon is not going to be to prevent fires everywhere, but that we know we have these higher risks, and so appropriate management in these areas can help us stabilize carbon. So that's a term I'd like you to think about a little bit, is integrating fire into thinking about carbon storage on a fire-prone landscape and what stabilizing carbon might look like instead of just actually accumulating carbon, because we know what the consequences of that can be. All right, so we talked about climate change as one of the threats, and carbon being a resource, as well as water and the other things I showed previously. So what we chose to do was to represent climate change and its threat by using a dissimilarity index that's based on about 11 different precip and temperature variables, and combined together with the different projections from the IPCC helped us see how much change there might be to our state. So here's a map of the expected climate dissimilarity, and you can see here the data projections are the data that's available between the year 1971 and 2000, and then the projected climate scenario. And I think we went up to like, I forget, 2055 kind of on average for the projection. So you can see much more change expected in the northern part of our state, which is where our forests lie. One of the things that was really appreciated in the last Forest Action Plan was that we documented the data gaps. What kind of data should the state be investing in, or what should we be gathering to do a better job of analyzing what we have to lose and what the threats to values are? All right, so lots of values, right? And we have all sorts of people weighing in on what's important to them. So actually, we have this even larger list of what's really important to maintain, and that shows up in the x-axis in the bottom. And you can see it ranges quite widely. And not surprisingly, because people are representing different agencies and perspectives, but we were fortunately able to boil this down at least somewhat for another analysis. So the state forestry partnered with not only the region, but the Rocky Mountain Research Station in a scenario development process for optimizing implementing work on the ground. And so for the purposes of that analysis, collaborators agreed that these are the top 3 things that were of interest. And because this is the Natural Areas Conference and biodiversity is something that a lot of you work on, just as kind of a flyby, we use the Critical Habitat Assessment Tool data. We have the State Forestry Organization actually manages the rare plant portfolio for the state. We included riparian areas. So anything that we could have that was representative biodiversity went into that. And then, of course, map communities and a variety of sources to characterize water source and transport. All right, so this map represents, when you put all those things together through this prioritization process that the research community came up with, it represents really where the overlap is. And these are HUC 12, so where you have 1 versus 2 versus 3 of those priority values, you can see where everything is kind of landing here. And so we're hoping that this can be useful guidance for partners moving forward and developing their work plans. All right, to the strategies. So that's the data. And then there's also, how do we work together and what are we going to work on? So there were 10 strategies that were developed: restoration, fire management, private land stewardship, and that includes things like the legacy program, reforestation, restoration economy, jobs creation and sustainable businesses, urban and community forestry. And I'm just going to show you a quick couple of examples of 2 different strategies that are new for us this time around. Because we've had so many fires, and a lot of them have been quite severe and left us with large areas without trees, frankly. And we don't have all the resources in the state to do the reforestation, that for the next 10 years, reforestation is going to be a collaborative strategy. And what I want you to note here is not only the existence of this strategy, but for each of the strategies, there are sub-strategies, there are outcomes, there are measures, and then who will be partnering to do the work. So we think that's going to be really helpful guidance. It's not kind of a wish list, but something more specific. And one more thing that's really exciting for us as conservation partners is really thinking carefully about fire. To date, our forestry organization for the state has had purely a suppression responsibility for fire. And there is, in parallel with the work that's going on with the development of the Forest Action Plan, there's also proposed legislation for the state to promote prescribed fire, and also kind of discussion of how the state forestry organization can contribute to ongoing private land, state-based land prescribed fire management. Well, I just want to say thank you, and you can see here at this nmfap.org, if you're interested in seeing the full assessment and the strategies and sort of plans for the future, I invite you to go there, and I thank you.